Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense to me. Actually, one of my questions was also going to be about like my own experience. My mother came from Vietnam in 1975, and in many ways, I feel like my own childhood was like being raised by all my aunts and uncles, and New Wave being like this escapist sound and fantasy experience, and I felt seen also when I watched this film. And I think it's very much a film about families, which is, quite obvious. It's so much of the plot.
Totally. It is a fam. People say, I feel seen as Asian Americans, as Vietnamese Americans, but even outside of our own communities, the family dysfunction. It's not just us in the AAPINH community. There's people outside of this community that have shared with me, like grown, white, cisgen men who are like, I know this story because my mom doesn't talk to her sister, and I just kind of learning about everybody's, what speaks to them has been very different, but also affirming, because you're like, oh, I didn't realize that this can draw so much emotion for folks. And I'm really grateful for that. I was like, where have you been my whole life? I wish I had made this film sooner, but I made it when I made it, and I'm learning about it when I learn about it, because I think that's a big part of what I live with now, is kind of learning to forgive myself, right? Because I have so much grief in the not having had a chance to know my mom for all those decades.
Yeah. And one of the questions that I wanted to ask you was kind of about the experience of making this film with your mom as part of it. I read in an interview somewhere that it wasn't the original intention of the film, that you were actually thinking about it more like a kind of like VH1 behind the music type film. And at what point in making it did that change for you? And did you realize, like, there's this other story that I need to tell as part of this film about the New Wave?
If there's any funders in this crowd, I'd still like to make that version of the film. We almost got to the end of that film. We were in a rough cut phase, and it was like a VH1 behind the music. It was very much like, why did the Vietnamese community make New Wave music? Why, who were the players and where are they now? And so that was the first version. I was not in that first version, and I spent 4 years with my team making that version of the film. But as the years went by, I was being asked a lot of questions from my film team, and also my daughter was growing up alongside the film, and she asked me one of the biggest questions, because she started to have a relationship and started to have memory at like around 3 years old. And she knew that my husband's mom, her grandmother, her paternal grandmother, was very present in her life. And she's like, well, Papa has a mama. Where's your mama? And that just like gutted me. And I think that was one of the biggest questions. And then I started to reflect on the stories that I was being told by each of the film participants. There were more than what you saw. It was more than Linda, and it was more than Ian. And they all were like, it didn't matter if you even had both parents. They're like, they just weren't around. It was everybody else taking care of us, or us taking care of ourselves. And I would cry through these interviews, but I was like, no, I don't want to tell traumatic stories. I'm tired of Vietnamese people being seen in this light. So move away from that. We got to get back to the music, the aesthetics, and just really have this fun, joyful music film. But what I was doing was avoiding the truth. And that truth was like this pain that everybody was carrying around and feeling. And so I think at that point I had to ask so much of my participants. And I didn't have much access either. As you can see, Linda's in a hotel room, Ian's in a hotel room. They wouldn't let me in some capacities, and I felt like if I wanted to get to the next phase, and my teammates, my producers, were asking these questions of me, like, what is the heart of the story? At year 4, I took a hammer to that first version of the film, because I was like, okay, you can just learn about the music, but what are you really trying to say about this community, about these people? So that was when I started to reflect on my own experience and say, oh, how does this displacement ripple through the generations? Like, how does it affect people like me as a second generation person and beyond? And so I started to explore the reason why I was estranged from my mom.
Yeah, that's, I love hearing that, because I think I'm so aware of family stories in this film, and the parallels even between the story of your mom and the story of Linda kind of raising or supporting her family, and the chosen families in the new wave party scene. And I wanted to ask how you kind of balance that with this celebration of hair and fashion and music, but it sounds like it was always there from the first interviews. Like, you were hearing it in every story, and your own story just like naturally led to that investigation and wanting to understand it.
Yeah, I think my first instinct when I started this journey was to avoid that, was to say, no, we need to just stay fit, on the music. So I think over time, I just got worn out. Like, everybody started to tell me the same stories. It was like, I didn't have either parent. I had one parent, or I had both parents, but they weren't really present in my life. They didn't accept me. They didn't like the things that I did. They didn't want me to do these things. I couldn't affiliate with certain people. So there's a lot of like, and it makes sense, right? You're displaced. You're not accepted in this country. You came from one of the most devastating wars that our country has ever seen. And, there's a lot of shame in that. And so I think like they didn't know where to go at all. You're not accepted at home, you're not accepted at school, you're not accepted at work. So here's this little safe space that you make in the film or in this music. And the film that I wanted to make was just like, let's just stay there. Let's not talk about all that other stuff that was hurting them. And it just got to a point where you're like, I have to include it. I have to include that truth.
Yeah, and it helps share the story of it in such a different way. It helps us see like the real historical roots of the music and understand like how it happened, why it happened. I wanted to ask about your experience just researching this film, because I think that new wave music is something that is well known in the Vietnamese community, not as well known outside of it, and not, I think, before this film, all that easily Googleable. And so when I imagine like how you have so many amazing photos and like footage, and you have these amazing interviews, when I imagine how you got all this, I kind of imagine it being very organic, like maybe starting in your family's archives and it leading to one person, the next person, and all of a sudden you're like interviewing Linda Jang. And I don't know if that's how it happened, no. But I want to know, like, how did you get all this material? How did it feel to be talking to people that are like pretty legendary in this history?
It was organic, and I'm like, you just answer it for me.
I guess.
But no, really, I was just in my own family archives to start, but my own family couldn't cover like this history, right? It was like a very personal history, and I was like, no, I'm going to avoid that. That was the first place I went, but then also the thing that I definitely pushed aside very quickly. I think as the months went by, I realized that, and I started to do outreach to, these folks in the community. I met Ian very randomly. It was like a revival party, one of these like new wave nights for folks in that generation. And I went out to, the party started at 9 and I'm there at like 8:30. He was one of the first people that showed up at 9. And he was like, his then girlfriend asked me what I was filming. And I just said, I want to learn more about why you guys have these revival parties. So he was the first person I spoke to. It was a coincidence or serendipity. And then with Linda, there's just no way to make a film about new wave without the Vietnamese Madonna. So that was a very challenging relationship. With Ian too, both of them very guarded people, but I pushed through because I felt like Ian had an incredible story to tell, and Linda too. I feel like maybe she didn't verbalize it, but from what she didn't say, I think she communicated a lot on screen about what she was feeling.
Yeah, their stories that you showcased had such amazing echoes to yours, and really brought the history together. I want to open it up to the crowd now. Does anyone have any questions for Elizabeth? Yes. We don't have another mic, but so you might have to shout, and then I'll repeat your question in the mic.
Okay. I really love how you started with New Wave, but it became a different story. And I think that what you did with the evolution of coming to the realization that it's not just your family and Linda's family, but there's a lot of families where when someone becomes successful in a family, that they're expected to help everybody else in their circle. But there's this mistake that a lot of people make when we're living in the moment of trying to provide for families and taking care of everybody around them, that money equals love. So how do you, what kind of advice would you give to people that being present is perhaps more important than just making money? How do you support your family best?
So the question is, how do you support your family best and help them see that money doesn't always just equal love?
Well, I don't have advice other than, I'm not a therapist. I'm working on myself still and very imperfect. But I think really around that, I'm working on that myself because that was the only way that I had, or not the only way, but a big way that I found love from my mom growing up, right? And it was something that I shunned. Look, I'm a filmmaker. No, so I'm not pursuing something where you're like, I don't have illusions of grandeur. I just really love what I do, and I think that I'm trying to be as present for my daughter. I think one of the hardest things right now is not being home with my daughter while I'm touring around with this film. So I don't have advice. I think we're all figuring it out. I don't think anybody has it fully figured out, and I think that it's a balance in that you're taking pause to reflect on the things that you really care about and give time and space to, that you invest your time and energy in the things that you love. And no, money isn't it. That I don't, we're living in a very challenging world right now, this film or not this film. And I have a lot of compassion because I know there's like single parents out there that work multiple jobs to make ends meet, and putting food on the table is love. So I don't have advice. I feel like everybody has a different circumstance. And with my mom, like I know as a woman myself, feeling that burden, I think that a lot of times in living in a very misogynistic society, it's an expectation. Right? I think that's what I also learned about my mom, is that everybody got to go to school, but because she was the eldest daughter, she was the only one that was asked to drop out. When my grandfather was a prisoner of war, she was the first person to be asked because she was the oldest daughter, but her older brother got to continue going to school. He went to college. Everybody else behind her continued to go to. And it's a really painful reality, something that I'm still kind of grappling with, and something I only learned in Jackson Hole very recently, that my mom didn't finish high school. And yeah, I don't know. I think that's something we all need to reflect on.
Yeah, and at the same time in this film, it's also a very inspiring story of female breadwinners and women who were providing for their families, which I think was very a testament to their strength and grit and ingenuity also. Yeah. Are there any other questions?
Yes?
Since the completion of the film, which was wonderful, by the way. go to therapy? Have you gone to therapy?
You know, I think everybody is going to be moving at their own pace. Everybody's on their own timeline. I think at the end of the film is like, I can ask the question, I can raise it, but you know, there's nobody that I can force into doing anything. So I can ask her about it, but I think she's just of a generation and of a culture and of a mindset that basically says like, because I grew up thinking that too. I think it's a great privilege. Now I understand. I'm like, oh, if you have insurance or the means to afford $250 for a 45-minute session with somebody, it's a great privilege. And to know that takes also a certain type of mentality, education, experience. So from when I grew up though, you know, not having a lot, it was, I still don't have a lot, but I mean, I have insurance now and, you know, like the means to know what it is. I was like, oh, I have a friend that goes, you know, I was in college, a friend that goes to therapy. They're crazy. And when I, you know, now I'm like, oh, okay, that was my ignorance, not the reality. You're like, oh, they have privilege. They have people that care about them that say, hey, you're going through stuff. You have anxiety about being in college or, you know, a breakup or whatever it's, or maybe some separation from your family, whatever it is. And those friends had privilege. So I don't know. I can ask my mom, but I also know it's a privilege to like unpack all that stuff to get to that point. It took making this film for me to understand the commitment to mental health and therapy, because I've been in therapy. I guess we'll just get into that right now. Is I always treated it like a doctor's visit, a dental visit. You just go, you do 10 sessions, you're stressed out about something, and then you move on. Then, you know, next time something comes up, I find a new therapist. It's, you know, but now I'm like, oh, I'm a workaholic, and I had to finish this film, and I had to get to the complete end of it. So 6 years in, I realized I'm so much more committed to myself, and that's the kind of commitment that you give to a therapist. You're building on a relationship, somebody that recognizes your patterns, can call you out on it, can work with you on it, and give you tools. So it's not so simple. You know, it took me making this film. I'm in my 40s. It's knowing that.
Yeah, it can be a long, long journey to unpack a lifetime of trauma and pain and generations.
And not wanting to be re-traumatized.
Yeah.
You know, it's very triggering if you don't have the guardrails. It's not so simple.
Yes, you.
Sorry. I just wanted to say that one of the most poignant moments of the film for me, and it was such a fleeting moment, but it's going to stay with me, is when Ian said, we were just trying too hard back then, right? And that moment for me, first of all, the whole film brought me back to my childhood and my aunt, and like her bringing me along to the new wave clubs, and me like as a child in awe of what I'm seeing, but also without the language to say what Ian just said, which was they're trying really hard to find something or to hold on to something or to, you know, I didn't have the language then, and I still see my aunt now, right, in her 60s, still trying. You know, she's left those new wave days behind, but it just was the whole, sorry, I don't have a fully formed idea, but that the film really hinged on that moment for me for some reason, because it was suddenly, you could never just talk about the music, but you also couldn't enter into these really complex stories without the music. And so I guess that
I guess I'll try to address the trying part. I feel like as children of immigrants or refugees, I don't think you could ever half-ass anything. I don't know. So when he's like, we were trying so hard, I don't know if you could not try that hard if he was like, I'm gonna be this thing. I think you kind of give it your all. I don't know. I think even like being, and maybe he didn't mean it in that way, but I think like he did go all the way. He ended up owning thousands of records and DJing all the time and taking it to this point where he has a day job but still has to figure out how to nurture his dream and his passion. You know, I feel like that's a really common thread in a lot of displaced folks that are trying to figure out life. It's like, one, you have to like nurture where you came from, your culture, your people, your parents, their expectations, and on the other hand you're like, but I have dreams and I have a life, and it sometimes it doesn't coincide with the expectations and the traditions of where I came from. And so you're like code switching. You're like, well, and then I go to school with these kinds of people and I work with these kinds of people, and you don't really know who you are and you're trying to figure it out, so you kind of do all the things. I'm sure that's like just a big balancing or spinning plates, juggling, whatever your analogy is. I think that's really hard, so I think we can all relate to that.
Yeah, and I also love how New Wave is a very like otherworldly and futuristic sound. And so like this idea of creative, this like Vietnamese American creativity that's found through this otherworldly future.
I love it.
Yeah.
I loved it. I guess I could share that when I was a kid, I loved it so much. And then when I became a teen in the 90s, I hated it so much. I was like, oh, cringe. That's old people music. To come back around and say, I love it again. It's like we evolve and we come back around. And, I feel like a part of it was very much like internalized racism, because it started off liking the Euro disco, the Italo disco, this music. And then, the Vietnamese diaspora started to cover it, and I felt like embarrassed at some point because I was like, oh, why does there have to be a Vietnamese Madonna? Why can't we have our own just Linda? Why does it have to be some sort of comparison? But then to think about like they were just trying to make ends meet and rub two nickels together. How could they, start their own thing? They were like, well, we know what our community likes. We're going to continue like covering this work. It's the easiest, the fastest way to get food on the table. And that's kind of the, coming at this point in my life from this vantage point, is to see that and understand that. It's really meaningful, and I'm like so in awe of what they were able to accomplish.
Yeah. For sure.
And the sound of the future, I love that, because when you think about all the Vietnam War films and like the CCR and the Jimi Hendrix and the Bob Dylans and that, there's a very specific analog kind of like classic rock sound, and for them to be like, oh, look at these bleeps and bloops, and it was the antithesis of what you had heard in the war films and that kind of that era. So I do feel like it is the future. Like sonically, they were like, let's move away from the analog and go somewhere else, and it really helped them.
Are there any other questions? Yes, in the red scarf.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So as a fellow documentarian making a personal documentary that centers on parent-child relationships that's evolving, I can really appreciate how much courage it takes to delve into a lot of the family, the painful past, the challenges. So I want to ask you, showing what the past.
Yeah, I can answer that one first. Regarding the reenactments, I say this, people ask in every Q&A, but I give the same responses. If you look up and, on Getty or National American Archives and you're looking for boy, 1980s, SoCal, beach, bike, like you're trying to find a boy on a bike on the beach in the 80s, right? You can find white boys or white girls for days. You just keep clicking on different pages, but the moment you put in like Asian or Vietnamese, it's like your search yields no results. So we did exist, right? And I think that's the whole point, is like the archives were incredibly hard to find and very challenging too when you're trying to clear them. If you do find something, you go back to Getty and they're like, that's $2,000 for that photo. So anyway, it was very, very hard. And so in using the reenactment, it was one way that I could honor that experience without going to the same material that I had repeatedly. And I just wanted to make sure that I could immerse people in that first time that Ian went to a club and he saw these Vietnamese people and they're all dancing in a club. I couldn't get that specific archive. So, and that was very special. I knew from the very beginning of this project, based on what was available on the internet, that I would be filming, these recreations. And the second or the first question that you asked about my mom, the first time she saw it on my couch, she didn't know that I was filming for a movie. She said, I'm collecting footage for my daughter because I don't know when I'll see you again. And do I have your permission? So I pretty much had my iPhone and I set my, digital camera down, and really my husband kind of on occasion, but he's like, I feel so uncomfortable around these conversations, just left me to my own devices. So I was like, okay, just record. And I just set it down because I didn't want to be in her face while we're having these hard conversations. So anyway, she came, I flew her in from Jackson Hole to sit on my couch. It felt very cozy, but she also didn't really know, she didn't know what I did for a living. So she was like, oh, okay, you have some film project, like an art project. Okay, you can make that film, good. And so I got her permission, and then I flew her out to Tribeca, where our film world premiered, and we were with hundreds of people. And my childhood best friend sat next to her and said that she was sobbing the entire time. So I think, culturally, we don't air our laundry. We are always like saving face, wanting to put our best out in the world. And I think for her, it was really hard to experience that with so many people. But we've talked about it since. It is a huge act of vulnerability and something that I'm still like practicing now, like not to completely shut down, but it's been really nice to share with so many folks on the road. It's making me feel like I'm gonna say it again, I'm not alone.
Let's take one more question from the crowd. Yes.
So, I've been wanting to do documentaries about the diaspora, and especially like stories from my parents. What was your process of getting Ian and Linda and even your boss to open up again? Because I know that's very hard.
The film did take 6 years. If everybody would just opened up right away, it would have been done probably in a fraction of the time. So really, it took time, and it took time on their schedules. Ian was a little bit more accessible, but Linda was, a fortress. And I don't know if I ever broke through, but that's why I said she communicates a lot more in how she behaves than what she's telling you. And I just trusted my team. I didn't do it alone. I have amazing editors and producers who were like, helping me say when it was enough, and really were just amazing creative collaborators.
So I just want to close by asking, what's next for New Wave? How can we support it? I know that you were saying you have a few screenings, but
yes.
yeah.
Well, I would love for you if you felt like this film touched you or moved you in some way, please review it on Letterboxd. It would mean a lot. We're looking for distribution, so it's something that we continue to push for, and a part of it is like Letterboxd is what we're saying the audience is saying about the film. I think tell your friends to come watch it if you know them in other cities. We're on Instagram at New Wave Documentary, and yeah, we're just kind of touring right now, so there's lots of different cities that'll show up, and we post about it all the time. And in terms of like other projects, I'm working on like a similar fiction like adaptation for television. So yeah, just doing the work, putting one foot in front of the other every day.
Well, congratulations. This film was so, as I said in the beginning, so fun to watch. It was so nice to talk to you and learn more about how it was made and some of the experiences you've had since it was made, and just also getting to talk to you about, you know, what the film was about and the experiences that you had. Thank you to this audience for being such a great set of people to watch the film with. I want to remind you all that there's an after party at Royal Buffet. I think for ticket holders. But thank you all for joining us for closing night, and thank you, Elizabeth, for coming down for the Q&A.
Thank you so much. Thank you, listening audience. I have heart. I'm so grateful to be here.